The party was Tessa's idea. It was held in the sprawling garden of her suburban home, complete with white bunting, a cake taller than sense, and hired musicians playing a string quartet version of Dancing Queen. The guests were curated, not friends of Margaret's, but people Tessa believed should be there: bankers, in-laws, her Pilates instructor, people who didn't know Margaret well enough to detect how miserable she was behind her tight-lipped smile. Margaret wore the beige cashmere cardigan Tessa had given her as a birthday gift, with the tags still on, as if to warn her not to get too attached. Her own tastes leaned toward bold floral prints and layered necklaces, things Tessa had declared a bit tragic, so Margaret obeyed the silent dress code and tried not to draw attention. After all, this was how it had always been. She smiled and nodded through toasts she hadn't written and memories recounted with glaring omissions. There was no mention of the years she worked 2 jobs to keep Tessa in ballet, no stories of the nights she stayed up sewing recital costumes by hand. Instead, Tessa took the microphone and launched into a mock roast about Margaret's love for cheap soap operas and overcooked pot roast. The crowd laughed. Margaret laughed too, or something close to it. Then came the shortbread. It was just a small plate of handmade biscuits, passed around with the tea. Margaret had baked them herself that morning. One small act of defiance. Her late mother's recipe, buttery and delicate, dusted with sugar. She offered Tessa a piece quietly, like a peace offering. Tessa glanced at it, then back at her guests. "Oh no, Mom," she said with a loud, performative laugh. "We don't need your rustic little bricks." The insult stung, but what came next split the air. As Margaret began to set the plate down, Tessa reached across the table, picked up a shortbread, and, in a gesture that seemed almost theatrical, flung it back toward the plate. It struck Margaret's cardigan and tumbled to the ground. "Oops," Tessa chirped. "Butterfingers." The garden went silent. Even the string quartet faltered mid-note. Margaret looked down at the crumbled piece near her shoes, then up at her daughter. Tessa had already turned away, laughing with a guest. No one said a word. She stood up slowly. The cardigan sagged at the shoulders, speckled with crumbs. With quiet, deliberate grace, Margaret picked up the shortbread, placed it back on the plate, and looked around the table. "I think," she said in a voice smooth and unreadable, "I've had quite enough of this." Someone, maybe Tessa's husband, maybe a cousin, let out a nervous chuckle, trying to diffuse the tension. But Margaret wasn't joking. She turned and walked through the garden gate, past the guests, past the violinist with the confused frown, and disappeared down the cobbled path that led to the street. No one followed her. It wasn't until hours later, when the guests were gone and the sun had dipped below the hedgerows, that Tessa finally called her. No answer. She sent a flurry of texts. "Where did you go? Are you being dramatic again? Please don't make this about you. You embarrassed me." The messages went unread. By morning, Margaret's phone was disconnected. 3 days later, her modest bungalow was found emptied. The furniture gone. Mail redirected. A for sale sign erected seemingly overnight. Bank accounts closed. Not even a forwarding address. It was like she had been erased. Tessa brushed it off at first, insisting to anyone who asked that her mother was having one of her moods, but even she couldn't deny the strangeness of it all. There were no social media traces, no sightings. No one had seen Margaret leave the neighborhood. No cab, no bus, no train ticket under her name. It was as if she'd stepped into a parallel universe. Family members began to call, more out of curiosity than concern. Whispers of Margaret's vanishing spread through church groups and neighborhood newsletters. Old tensions were dragged into the light, resentments about inheritance, unresolved slights, debts unpaid. Some blamed Tessa. Others wondered aloud if Margaret had been hiding something. But the most unnerving part came when Margaret's best friend, Iris, arrived at Tessa's home 2 weeks later holding a wooden key. "She told me never to open this without her," Iris said, handing Tessa a narrow, dusty chest. "And if anything ever happened, you were not the one meant to receive what's inside." Tessa laughed bitterly. "So why bring it to me?" "Because," Iris said, placing the chest firmly on the table, "I think she wanted you to open it. She just didn't want you to understand it." The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Inside, a single envelope, thick with folded pages. No jewelry, no keepsakes. Just a letter addressed, not to Tessa, but to Harriet. "Who the hell is Harriet?" Tessa whispered. And for the first time since the party, she felt something unfamiliar begin to creep in. Not guilt, not shame, fear. For 3 days, Tessa told herself it was a stunt. Her mother had always been sensitive, dramatic, overly emotional. She'd probably gone to Iris's house to sulk, or taken some ridiculous retreat to reconnect with herself, as she used to threaten during minor family spats. Tessa pictured her drinking chamomile tea in some forest commune, waiting for everyone to come crawling back with apologies. But by the end of the week, that fantasy was harder to maintain. The bank had confirmed it first. Margaret had closed every account 2 days before the birthday party. Not frozen. Not paused. Closed. Then came the shock from the real estate agent. Her house, Margaret's little ivy-covered bungalow, had been privately sold to a cash buyer weeks before the party. Even more unsettling, the agent revealed Margaret had visited her office months earlier, asking about discreet liquidation. Tessa laughed nervously, half hoping the agent would laugh too. She didn't. "She said she wanted to begin her exit strategy," the woman said, puzzled. Like she was wrapping up a business, not a life. Within days, Margaret's name was stripped from every utility, lease, and community registry. Her car, a beat-up Toyota she'd used for grocery runs and school pickups back in the day, was sold to a scrapyard. Gone. Like she'd burned the breadcrumbs behind her. Tessa kept the discovery to herself at first. She didn't want the others to know how rattled she was. But then came the chest. It had been tucked in the linen closet, behind old towels and expired linens. Iris had kept it for years, a promise made long ago in a moment of wine-drunk confession, when Margaret had said, "If I ever vanish, this is the only thing that matters." Tessa had never even known it existed. The chest itself was unremarkable, wooden, narrow, a keyhole shaped like a teardrop. Inside, a single letter. Cream envelope, elegant script, to Harriet. Tessa stared at it for hours that night, sitting cross-legged in her childhood bedroom with the door locked. The name sent her mind spinning. Harriet? A middle name? An alias? A friend? The handwriting was unmistakably her mother's, slanted and neat, the way she used to sign school permission slips. She opened the envelope. Inside were 5 folded pages. No date, no return address. The letter began not with "Dear," but simply "Harriet." "I never thought I'd write this, but if you're reading it, something has happened. Either I've had the courage to walk away, or I've been forced to disappear. There are things I've hidden, not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't believe anyone would understand. I've spent my life apologizing for choices that were never mine to make, for surviving in ways that others found inconvenient." Tessa felt her pulse quicken. "You don't know me as you should, but you were always in my mind, especially in the quietest moments. The kind of silence only a mother carries. You are part of me in a way that Tessa never was." The words stopped her cold. She reread them 3 times, as if they might rearrange themselves into something less incriminating. But they didn't. "Tessa was my duty. You were my beginning." Tessa threw the letter across the room. Her breath came short and fast. Was Harriet a metaphor? A delusion? Or worse, a real person? The next morning she showed up at Iris's house unannounced. "I need answers," she snapped. "About Harriet. About my mother." Iris didn't flinch. She was stirring a pot of soup as if she'd been expecting this. "I told her not to send that letter," Iris said calmly. "I told her it would do more harm than good. But she said Harriet deserved to know." Tessa's voice cracked. "Know what?" Iris sighed. "That Margaret had another life before you. Another child. Another name, even. You didn't come first, Tessa. You came after." Tessa reeled. "That's not possible. She would have told me." "No," Iris said. "She wouldn't. You made it clear years ago that the only version of her you could love was the one who gave up everything for you." That night, Tessa scoured her mother's remaining papers, birth certificates, tax forms, old journals, but there were strange absences, years unaccounted for. A gap between 1981 and 1984 that Margaret had always skimmed past when telling stories. And in one old family photo, faded and brittle, was a woman who looked like Margaret, but younger, harder, with short hair and dark eyes full of something dangerous. On the back, written in faint pencil, "Harriet, age 3, Seaside, 1983. She ran her fingers over the writing, half in disbelief. So it was true. Her mother had been someone else, lived as someone else, before she became mom. The betrayal sank in slowly, not as rage but as something colder. For the first time in her life, Tessa wasn't angry because her mother had failed her. She was angry because maybe her mother had never belonged to her at all. Tessa had grown up believing her mother had no secrets. Margaret was the kind of woman who left her door unlocked, paid bills early, and kept every receipt in labeled folders. Her life had seemed so painfully ordinary that Tessa often resented her for it. No mystery, no ambition, just casseroles, folded laundry, and a permanent smile that always seemed 2 degrees too polite. But now, Margaret had disappeared into a fog of lies that no one, least of all her daughter, could seem to penetrate. The photo of the child labeled Harriet had become Tessa's obsession. She enlarged it, scanned it, sharpened it. The girl had Margaret's cheekbones, the same unruly curls, but the eyes were harder, wiser, like they'd seen something no child should ever have to witness. Tessa started digging. The seaside village referenced on the back of the photo, Barrow Sands, was a place Margaret had mentioned only once, in passing while folding laundry. Ugly little town, too many secrets. At the time, Tessa had rolled her eyes. Now she booked a train there under a false name. Barrow Sands hadn't changed much. It was the kind of coastal place where windows rattled in the wind and everyone knew when you were a stranger. The innkeeper gave her a suspicious glance when she asked about the old nursing home, the Haven, now boarded up and covered in ivy. "Used to be a home for girls in trouble," the woman said, stirring a chipped mug of tea. "Runaways, pregnant ones. Margaret was one of them, wasn't she?" Tessa froze. "You knew her?" The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. "She went by Maggie Keene back then. Quiet girl. Disappeared one night. Just like she did now." Tessa visited the shuttered building the next day. Weeds strangled the fence and no trespassing signs hung like warnings from another life. Still, she slipped inside. In the ruined dormitory, she found remnants: an old hairbrush, a broken cot, a torn prayer book, and then, in the office, an old filing cabinet still bolted to the floor. Inside, she found what she wasn't ready for. A file labeled Keene am admitted, April 4, 1982, status, expectant mother guardian, unknown discharge, refused. Patient fled facility, child placed into temporary care. Tessa's throat closed. Child placed into care. There was a copy of a birth certificate, a name scribbled in the margins, Harriet June. No father listed. The photo now made sense. The letter made sense. Margaret had fled the home, leaving behind a daughter, and never spoken of it again. But the next file was worse. A court document dated 6 months later, stamped confidential. Petition for termination of parental rights, Margaret Keene. Filed by Social Services, Barrow County. rationale, abandonment, unstable living conditions, suspected mental breakdown. Tessa stared at the words. Her mouth went dry. Margaret hadn't just given Harriet up. She'd been forced to. She left the building in a fog. Her mother, so small, so forgettable in her own life, had once fought a system determined to erase her. She had lost. And then started over, without ever speaking of the fire she'd crawled from. But as Tessa boarded the train home, she noticed something strange. In her satchel, between the court records, was a photo she hadn't packed. A recent one, glossy, sharp, printed on modern paper. It showed a woman in a business suit standing before a row of glass buildings. Cropped blonde hair. Pen in hand, strong jaw, crisp posture, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The name on the etched placard behind her, Harriet June Callister, CEO, Callister and Wren Technologies. Tessa stared. It was her, the child from the photo, all grown up. But how had this photo appeared in her bag? She flipped it over. On the back, written in unfamiliar handwriting, "Now do you understand what she left behind?" Her skin prickled. Was someone following her? Back in London, things had changed. Her husband Ben was distant. Her daughter Lily kept asking, "Where's Grandma gone?" And the gossip in the family WhatsApp group had turned vicious. One cousin suggested Margaret was off having an affair. Another claimed she'd been diagnosed with dementia and wandered off. A convenient fantasy. Only Iris remained silent. Tessa returned to her mother's journals, desperate to understand the woman she thought she'd known. One entry, dated 5 years earlier, stood out. They say silence is self-preservation. But I think it's something worse. It's slow erasure. I keep asking myself, if I screamed in the middle of my own life, would anyone even hear it? Beneath it, a single line. I lost one daughter because I had no power. I lost the second because I gave it all away. Tessa stared at the page. She meant me. The words sank like stones in her gut. Maybe the Shortbread incident hadn't been the cause of Margaret's disappearance at all. Maybe it had simply been the final ridiculous straw. The truth was beginning to form, like a storm on the horizon. Margaret wasn't lost. She hadn't snapped. She'd planned this. And now, one haunting question hung in the air. Was Harriet back too? They didn't recognize her at first. It was a crisp autumn morning when Margaret waltzed through the heavy glass doors of the Leighton Hotel ballroom, the very one her daughter had used a year earlier for a corporate gala. She wore crimson, a sharply tailored suit with silk lapels, matching lipstick, and black heels that clicked like punctuation on marble. Heads turned, conversations faltered. The woman who entered was not the fragile, apologetic mother they remembered. She was someone else entirely. Tessa blinked from across the room, her glass trembled in her hand. It was her, Margaret, alive, radiant, and carrying the kind of presence you couldn't ignore, even if you tried. The event was a fundraiser for a domestic violence shelter. Tessa had been asked to speak. Her company was one of the corporate sponsors. It was meant to be a moment of redemption, a way to paint over the scandal of her mother's disappearance with performative generosity. But Margaret, as if scripted by fate, had stolen the spotlight, and then the MC approached the microphone. "We're honored today to acknowledge a remarkable donor who has contributed a transformative gift to our cause. Please welcome Margaret Ashcroft." Ashcroft? Tessa turned to stone. Margaret stepped up to the microphone, smiling as if she'd never known shame. "I was once a woman who forgot her own name," she began. "But that's the thing about forgetting. It creates space to remember who you were before the world told you who to become." Polite applause. Tessa's mouth was dry. Ashcroft? That name was familiar. Elite. Wealthy. The Ashcroft estate? Wasn't that some historic manor sold off a decade ago? Then Margaret continued, "This donation is made in honor of my daughter, Tessa Hartley, whose fire taught me that quiet suffering is not noble, only invisible. I see you now, and I thank you for the lesson." More applause. Cameras flashed. Tessa felt a strange mix of horror and humiliation. It wasn't an attack. It was worse, a benevolent public rewrite. Her mother had just reframed her humiliation as empowerment and hijacked the narrative entirely. After the speech, Margaret moved through the crowd like a seasoned diplomat, confident, charming. She made eye contact. She laughed. A real, throaty laugh no one had ever heard from her before. Tessa cornered her in the hallway near the restrooms. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed. Margaret sipped from a champagne flute. "Reintroducing myself? You disappeared. People thought you were dead." "I was." Margaret stepped closer, her eyes sharper than Tessa remembered. "You threw shortbread at me, Tessa, in front of my grandchildren. Do you know how many years I swallowed things harder than that?" Tessa's voice dropped. "Where have you been?" Margaret leaned in, whispering like it was gossip. "Abroad. Tuscany. Then Devon. A bit of estate law in between." "Estate?" "I inherited the Ashcroft fortune. Quite suddenly." Tessa froze. "From who?" But Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she handed Tessa a crisp envelope. Inside, legal documents naming Margaret as the sole beneficiary of the Ashcroft estate, valued at just over £9.8 million. Tessa's knees nearly gave out. "I don't understand. Who were they to you?" Margaret smiled, eyes unreadable. "Old friends. People who saw me before I faded." Before Tessa could protest, a man approached. Polished. Mid-40s. Gray eyes, expensive suit. "Elijah Grant," he said, extending a hand. "I'm the executor of the Ashcroft estate." Tessa barely shook it. "She didn't even know the Ashcrofts," she muttered. Elijah cocked an eyebrow. "Oh, but she did. Quite intimately. Margaret's time with them predated you by a long shot." Margaret tilted her head. "Not everything in my life is about you, darling." And then she was gone again, gliding back into the ballroom, surrounded by admirers, her presence eclipsing Tessa like a solar flare. The fallout began the next day. The press ran with headlines like, "Vanishing Mother Returns as Millionaire Philanthropist," "Margaret Ashcroft from Forgotten to Fearless." Where was she, and what does she know? Social media exploded. Strangers praised Margaret as a quote, survivor, a symbol of second chances, a quote, quiet rebel finally taking up space. Tessa's inbox flooded with requests for comment. Her PR team begged her to post a smiling photo with her mother, just for optics, but Tessa refused. Instead, she scoured every record she could find on the Ashcrofts. A reclusive couple. Old money. No children of their own. Known for supporting women's education and literacy charities. Their estate, a cliffside property in Cornwall, had been passed down through quiet, deliberate hands, until now. But the biggest shock came days later, when a package arrived at Tessa's door. Inside, a leather-bound photo album, page after page of photos. Margaret, in her 20s, smiling with a man who could only be one of the Ashcrofts. Tea parties, garden walks, a birthday cake with Margaret's name spelled in frosting. At the back, a note. "They saw me when I had no one. They believed me when no one else would. And they helped me keep the one secret I could never say out loud." Tessa's blood chilled. What secret? And why was Elijah now calling her directly, asking for a private meeting about a potential issue with the will? As the Ashcroft mystery deepened, and Margaret rose like a phoenix from the ashes of her old life, one thing became disturbingly clear. This wasn't a spontaneous comeback. It was a return orchestrated with precision. And Margaret hadn't come back for closure. She'd come back with a purpose. Tessa had never been good at playing second fiddle, and she wasn't about to start now. Margaret's transformation had lit the press on fire, turning her into a media darling and modern-day fairy tale. Talk shows dissected her disappearance like it was strategy. Bloggers hailed her as a feminist icon. Even Tessa's own assistant had sheepishly asked, "Have you seen the Vogue profile? Your mom looks incredible." But all Tessa could see was a threat. And she wasn't alone. The rest of the family, cousins, uncles, half-siblings, who hadn't called Margaret in years, were suddenly clamoring to reconnect. They sent Margaret flowers, left voice messages layered in guilt, and dug out dusty photo albums for performative social media posts. All of them wanted something. Because now Margaret wasn't just the overlooked matriarch, she was valuable. The Ashcroft estate wasn't just land and legacy, it was leverage. And Tessa needed in. She requested a meeting with Elijah Grant, the slick, impenetrable lawyer who had become Margaret's new shadow. He agreed, but only under strict conditions. Neutral ground. No media. No recording devices. They met at a discreet club in Mayfair. Elijah arrived precisely on time, sipping an espresso completely unbothered. "I want to see the full will," Tessa said, before the pleasantries had even ended. Elijah's smile was professional and faintly amused. "You've already seen the public record," he replied. "Your mother is the sole inheritor. There are no contested claims." She was a housewife. With no income. No standing. You don't just stumble into an estate worth millions unless you have something on someone. Elijah's fingers tapped his glass. "Are you suggesting blackmail?" "I'm suggesting manipulation. My mother's very good at playing the martyr." A pause. Elijah leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There is something. A clause? Buried deep in the third addendum." Tessa's pulse spiked. "Go on." "Conditional inheritance," he said. "It's standard. But in this case, rather curious. The estate passes entirely to Margaret, unless someone else can prove they were born of Ashcroft bloodline." Tessa blinked. "Excuse me?" "Specifically, any biological child born to either Leopold or Eleanor Ashcroft before 1980, whether acknowledged or not. In which case, the estate is to be split 50-50 with said child." Tessa's thoughts spiraled. Biological child? Margaret was born to working-class parents in Nottingham. She'd never even mentioned the Ashcrofts until now. Or had she? The photos. The seaside. The strange familiarity in Margaret's voice when she spoke about Eleanor Ashcroft as if they'd once shared secrets. "You're telling me there might be an heir," she said slowly. "I'm telling you there might already be one. Or two." "Two?" Elijah paused. "Someone contacted my office, a woman named Harriet Lang. She believes she's connected. Her name appears in a sealed letter Margaret left behind before her disappearance. She's requested a DNA test." The name struck like a whip. Harriet. The name from the letter. The name Tessa had found hidden in the chest in her mother's attic. She had assumed Harriet was a pseudonym, or perhaps a hidden version of her mother's past. But now, a different possibility bloomed. Margaret didn't disappear to escape. She disappeared to prepare. Later that night, unable to sleep, Tessa broke into Margaret's old storage unit using the spare key she'd once stolen in her teens. She combed through boxes, photo albums, costume jewelry, faded recipe books. But in one unmarked folder, she found it. A single sheet of parchment, handwritten and elegant. It was a birth certificate. Harriet Eleanor Lang, born May 2, 1978. Mother, Margaret Evelyn Hartley. Father, unknown. Place of birth, Ashcroft Manor, Cornwall. Tessa's mouth went dry. This wasn't a fabrication. It wasn't myth. It was real. Margaret had given birth at Ashcroft Manor. Harriet wasn't a fantasy. She was a sibling. And under the conditions of the will, she was a legal threat. The next morning, Margaret held a press conference on the steps of the Ashcroft Foundation. She looked luminous in dove-gray silk, flanked by Elijah and a new, unfamiliar figure. A tall woman with sleek black hair, poised and unreadable. "This is Harriet Lang," Margaret said with serenity. "My daughter, my firstborn. She was raised in another home, not out of shame but out of survival. Today, she joins me in building a legacy focused on healing, equity, and truth." The cameras flashed. Tessa could barely breathe. She had always believed herself to be Margaret's only daughter, the central sun around which her mother quietly orbited. But now she saw it for what it was. She hadn't been orbiting her mother. Her mother had been hiding another world entirely, and Tessa had never even noticed the eclipse. Tessa stared at the woman across the table like she was a ghost. Harriet Lang. 47. CEO of a tech logistics empire. Calm, articulate, surgically polite, and apparently her sister. Or so the headline said. Margaret had made it official with a single sweeping gesture, a public reunion framed as redemption. But for Tessa, it wasn't redemption. It was an invasion, an erasure. Like someone had edited her entire life and forgotten to ask permission. "Why now?" Tessa asked, arms folded tightly across her chest. "Why appear now, after all these years?" Harriet, seated in the corner booth of the upscale hotel lounge, didn't blink. "Because I didn't know until 3 weeks ago." Convenient. More like cruel. Imagine discovering the mother you never knew faked her own disappearance, just to finally introduce herself on a public stage. Tessa tried to read her tone, but Harriet's composure was infuriatingly opaque, controlled, polished. She was everything Tessa had fought to be in business, but she hadn't earned it through sacrifice. She had inherited it. Or had she? As Harriet placed a photograph on the table, something in Tessa's stomach turned. It was an old snapshot, faded and curled at the edges. 2 teenage girls, arms around each other. One was unmistakably Margaret, younger, livelier, with fire in her eyes. The other? Eleanor Ashcroft. "My grandmother," Harriet said quietly. Margaret lived with the Ashcrofts for 2 years. She was their ward, until she wasn't. Tessa's throat tightened. "You're saying my mother was adopted by the Ashcrofts?" "No," Harriet said. "I'm saying she was used." According to documents Harriet had uncovered, Margaret had been taken in after her own mother fell ill. The Ashcrofts offered her education, class, safety, but it came at a price. She became Eleanor's ladies' maid-in-training, her secret keeper, her surrogate daughter, until one summer, everything changed. She got pregnant, Harriet said. No father listed, just silence. Then she was sent away. 9 months later, I was born, given to another family. Margaret disappeared from the Ashcroft world after that, Tessa reeled. "And you believe this?" "I did a DNA test. Eleanor Ashcroft is my grandmother, biologically, which makes Margaret my mother," Tessa snapped. There it was, the crack in her voice, the panic seeping through, because for the first time in her life, Tessa wasn't sure she was the favored daughter. Every achievement she'd built, every moment of pride she'd squeezed from Margaret's tight-lipped praise, it was all part of a story she thought she owned. But Harriet's existence proved otherwise. Margaret had a chosen child once, and it wasn't Tessa. Later that night, Tessa ransacked her mother's old writing desk, still stored in the garage of Margaret's former home, the one Tessa had kept, stubbornly refusing to sell. She found notebooks, journals, receipts, but one page stood out. a journal entry, undated, torn at the edges. Tessa never understood softness. I taught her sharpness, not because I wanted to, but because it was all I had left. Harriet was taken from me, stolen, and with her, the part of me that believed in second chances. I raised Tessa to survive, not to trust. Was that love? I wonder, still. Tessa nearly tore the page in two. This wasn't clarity. This was betrayal, written in delicate cursive. Back at the Ashcroft estate, Harriet and Margaret were already planning renovations. They were starting a foundation. They were smiling for photographs, rebuilding a bond that was 30 years too late. And the world loved it. Tessa was no longer the accomplished daughter who kept the family afloat. She was the one who threw shortbread at her mother, and then watched that mother rise like a phoenix, holding the hand of a daughter who looked like she'd never been forgotten. But just as the story seemed cemented, a twist cracked through the polished surface. A former Ashcroft maid, now in a nursing home, reached out to the press. She claimed she remembered the summer Margaret vanished. She was pregnant with twins, the woman whispered into the reporter's recorder. I helped carry the basket down to the car. There were two, not one. The story exploded. Margaret denied it, at first. Elijah issued a measured no comment. But Harriet's face told another story. She hadn't heard it either, and now the question wasn't just, who is Harriet? It was, who was the second child, and where had they gone? Tessa, for all her rage and jealousy, had never imagined another sibling was out there. Was she the twin? Was Harriet? Was there a third piece in this fractured puzzle? Or had Margaret, once again, buried something too deep to face? One thing was clear. Whatever Margaret was building now, legacy, empire, narrative, it was about to crack open. Because the past doesn't stay buried forever, especially when it's family. Margaret always said she wasn't a strategist, but that was the greatest misdirection of them all. It started with a box, innocuous, dust-covered, found in the back of Margaret's former sewing room. Tessa had returned to the house in a last-ditch attempt to make sense of the chaos. With Harriet living in the Ashcroft estate and Margaret now being courted by legacy journalists and women's rights circles, Tessa was flailing for any remaining connection. The box was filled with notebooks, old ledgers, scraps of to-do lists going back more than a decade. At first, they looked like ordinary notes, groceries, gardening plans, birthdays. But then Tessa found something strange. Dates cross-referenced with names, followed by a single phrase repeated over and over again. Preparation, practice, proof. One entry, dated 7 years prior, chilled her to the core. Eleanor Ashcroft is weakening. Her guilt seeps through every letter. She wants to make amends before the end. She doesn't say it directly, but I know what she's asking. That I take it, the estate, the history, the burden. I won't do it without a plan. I won't disappear again unarmed. Tessa turned the page and found a full flowchart, hand-drawn in Margaret's small, neat handwriting. It outlined contingencies, media exposure routes, legal inheritance frameworks, potential family reactions. Every name in the family had a column, likely to object, vulnerable to guilt, potentially useful. And next to Tessa's name? Emotionally reactive, needs control, will self-destruct if positioned as excluded. Tessa stared at the words until they blurred. This wasn't just a survival tactic, it was a playbook. Margaret had engineered her exit, her silence, and her return. She had leveraged her trauma into strategy, weaving her pain into something so airtight it could pass for destiny. In another journal, Tessa found an entry from 5 years earlier, written just days after a major fight between them. She says I never supported her. But how do you support a storm? I tried to love Tessa in the only way I knew, through structure, through sacrifice. But it made her cruel, not careful. So I must disappear in a way that is undeniable. She must feel absence before she can feel truth. The more Tessa read, the more the shape of her mother's vanishing transformed. It wasn't about fleeing humiliation. It was about reclaiming authorship. Margaret had sold her house quietly, through an offshore agent listed under a pseudonym. She'd shifted her accounts into a trust years ago. She'd built relationships with charity boards, advisors, and even Elijah, who, as it turned out, wasn't just the executor of the Ashcroft estate. He had met Margaret long before. They had once been lovers. Tessa uncovered an email chain between Margaret and Elijah, dated 3 years before her disappearance. In it, they discussed Phase 2 of re-entry and the day the shortbread breaks. If it happens, it's the signal. The signal. The shortbread incident hadn't just been a humiliating outburst. It was trigger protocol. Margaret had anticipated that something like it would occur, had, in fact, prepared for the possibility that her own daughter would eventually give her an excuse to sever the cord. But here was the final twist. Margaret didn't plan the shortbread. Tessa did. In another buried document, a private therapy note from a counselor Margaret had seen for years, there was a passage that read, "Tessa is unraveling. I love her. I fear her. I worry she is addicted to control and allergic to softness. If she ever lashes out publicly, it will be my window. I'll let the storm come. And then I will step outside it." She let it happen. She baited it. Not overtly, not cruelly, but with silence, with passivity, with a soft, well-timed remark that would spark the fuse. Margaret hadn't run. She'd waited, and then she'd walked through the door she knew Tessa would kick open. Back at the Ashcroft estate, Margaret was beginning to hold salon-style gatherings. Women from all over the country, authors, activists, survivors, scholars, sat in her parlor discussing inheritance and reinvention. Harriet moved through the halls like she'd always belonged, growing closer to Margaret each day. But in private, she'd begun to question the timeline. One night, Harriet asked Elijah, "Did you know about me before I found you?" Elijah hesitated. Then, "She gave me your name 2 years ago." She didn't want to reach out until she'd rebuilt herself, until she was someone worth meeting. Harriet's jaw tensed. Did she ever plan to tell me about the other child? Elijah didn't answer. But the silence said enough. Because now there were 3. Margaret, Harriet, and whoever. Wherever. The second child had gone. And that missing thread was the only thing left that could unravel Margaret's perfect plan. The invitation came sealed in crimson wax, hand-delivered by a private courier. "You are cordially invited to the public reading of the revised will of Margaret Elaine Holloway, Ashcroft Estate, 3 p.m. All concerned parties are required to attend." Concerned was one word for it. Terrified was another. Tessa arrived first, dressed in navy and defiance. Harriet followed soon after, cool and polished in cream silk, flanked by her assistant and Elijah, who looked as unreadable as ever. Cousins, former friends, distant relatives, even journalists, filtered in one by one, eyes wide, whispers tight. Then, right at the stroke of 3, Margaret appeared. She wore red. Not a subtle maroon or a conservative wine. Red. Crimson, commanding, with a diamond brooch at her throat in the shape of a phoenix. "I thank you for coming," she said, voice clear as glass, "to witness the closing of one book and the beginning of a new one." The lawyer began to read. The crowd held its breath. Margaret's revised will was not merely a legal document, it was a manifesto. She left the Ashcroft estate to be turned into a permanent foundation, a retreat and think tank for women over 50 seeking a new start after familial abandonment, financial hardship, or emotional neglect. Her personal assets, which thanks to years of careful investments, totaled in the millions, were divided not by bloodline, but by principle. Harriet was left the stewardship of the foundation and an annotated archive of Margaret's life, labeled "For the Daughter Who Sought Truth." Tessa's name came next. Every eye in the room turned. To Tessa Evelyn Holloway, I leave my silence, for I have given you my voice for 65 years. However, I also leave you the deed to the orchard cottage on Windmere Lane. It is empty. It is quiet. I hope you fill it with something other than noise. A murmur ran through the room like a chill, but the final twist came not in the will, but in the speech Margaret gave next. She stepped forward, holding a small envelope, yellowed, sealed, and trembling in her hand. "This," she said, "was meant to be burned. I chose not to. Because every story deserves an ending." She opened it slowly. Inside, a birth certificate. "Years ago," she began, "I gave birth to twin girls. Only one was placed for adoption, Harriet. The other, I was told, did not survive. I believed that for decades. I never saw a body, never signed anything. But I was young, powerless, and grieving." Her voice caught just once. "A week ago, I received this." She held up a printed email. "A DNA match. Confirmed. A woman named Vivienne Stone. Born Vivienne Holloway, raised in foster care, no record of adoption, no memory of me." Gasps rippled. Vivienne entered the room then. Quietly, unannounced, standing in the back like a shadow made flesh. She was lean, dark-eyed, cautious. A mirror of Margaret's youthful photographs, wrapped in layers of distance. "I've spoken with her," Margaret said. "Once." That was enough to know. The lie that was told to me, that my child had died, was part of a broader theft. My voice, my choice, my life. Tessa stood suddenly. "So that's it? Another daughter? What does she get? A mansion? A speech?" "No," Margaret said simply. "She gets the truth, and the freedom to decide what to do with it." Tessa's fury broke open like a dam. "All these years you played the victim," she snapped. "But you were the one pulling strings. Manipulating. Vanishing. Setting fire to the people who tried to love you." "You didn't love me," Margaret interrupted, her voice like a whip. "You tolerated me. When I was useful. When I was quiet. When I made you feel powerful. But the moment I made space for myself, you threw shortbread at my face, like I was a servant." Tessa's mouth opened. Closed. Silence. "I don't hate you, Tessa," Margaret said, "but I won't center you anymore. I spent a lifetime rewriting myself into a role you could accept. I won't do it again." Then, softly, "I never told you about your father because he didn't choose you. I did. I chose to have you. I chose to raise you. That's more than he ever gave." Tessa broke. The tears came hard, angry, ugly, and she left the room without another word. Margaret turned to Harriet, who was already holding her hand, and to Vivienne, who gave the smallest nod of acceptance from across the room. The reading ended, not in applause nor confrontation, but in stillness. Because sometimes the most radical act isn't revenge, it's reinvention. Outside, the press waited. Margaret stepped into the light, no longer a vanished woman or a neglected mother, but a rewritten legacy in red.